I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, I guess we're kind of building up to our Lucian series.
Kind of unintentionally. We just, I mentioned doing Shen Songwen. You were on board, but then you countered with another modern Chinese writer, and we realized actually it's kind of a good on-ramp for our Lucian series coming up in January.
Yeah, I think we're going to air that in January. Xiao Hong is, we haven't done enough female writers, and no. Xiao Hong is one of the bigger names in the May 4th movement, or the pre-1949 period. Rob, had you ever read Xiao Hong?
I had not, to my shame, until you suggested her. I had not read Xiao Hong.
We looked at a frequently anthologized story, Hands, today. As we explain the plot, pretty quickly become clear why it's called Hands. Just briefly, Xiao Hong was born in 1911. She died in 1942 in Hong Kong. She lived a pretty miserable life. She's from Heilongjiang. She was in an arranged marriage. That husband abandoned her with child in a hotel. She kind of drifted, and then she started writing. Most of the things she wrote were pretty sad stories about the miserableness of being a woman in pre-1949 China. Should we just jump into the story, Rob?
As you mentioned, the story itself is fairly easy to summarize. It is about a girl named Wang Yaming who is at a boarding school. We're not told where, just a boarding school. She comes from a family of dyers, D-Y-E-R-S, very, very, very poor. And because her hands are discolored and because she's very rough and unlettered and comes from a very poor family, unlike her classmates who at least appear to have a lot more money, sophistication, white skin, the whole thing, she gets treated like doo-doo.
No one wants to share a bed with her. They keep saying because her hands are dark that she has bugs in her or something. She's almost treated herself like some sort of vermin. She's forced to sleep on a bench. She's not very intellectually gifted, I would say. At least that's how she's portrayed in the story. And so she keeps getting made fun of, both for her hands, but also her trouble at acquiring English.
The headmistress won't let her be seen by anyone. So if there are foreigners walking by in the street, she makes the Wang Yaming stay inside. If there's anyone visiting the school, she has to stay in the basement.
What actually happened with those foreigners is, so every morning this school had calisthenics that everyone was required to do, and the headmistress goes, actually, our walls are a little short, and so it's entirely possible that some foreigners could walk by and see your hands, and they're so gross that you're not allowed to do calisthenics. Rob, you were talking about how tough of a read this was.
It's tough, brutal. Man. It's a tough read. Now, part of that is because there are a few kinds of narratives that I just can't handle. One of them is extreme cruelty to children. I can't. It's really hard for me to get through. And this is just unrelenting melancholy. Nothing good. Anything good happens to this girl. Nothing.
She eventually is. I don't think this
flunks
is
out.
A spoiler. Yeah, I couldn't really, I guess she did flunk out, but her father was struggling to pay for school anyways. She just kind of is forced out, and it's so sad, that ending. Her father can't come to pick her up that day, and so she strives to learn a little bit more for the rest of the day until her father can come pick her up, as if learning one more day would really make that much of a difference. It's
brutal.
I was really cheering Wang Yaming on, and it's hard.
It's hard, and I can't help it with narratives like this. It's hard to really feel that invested in them after a while. The narratives involving struggle that really hit home the hardest are the ones that typically have at least a little bit of light involved.
Rob, I wanted to ask you, so I agree with you that normally there is this kind of, in stories, in good stories, there is something to take away from all the sorrow. If the author wants the narrator to be sympathetic and watching all of this horrible stuff happen to another person, they make the narrator kind of befriend them or something.
Yeah.
The narrator, whose name I don't think we ever get, how does the narrator treat Wang Yaming? Is she any nicer? The narrator's another girl in the school, just like Wang Yaming and the rest of them. She's kind of brutal herself, isn't she?
She starts out kind of like all the others. By the end, she seems to sort of grudgingly accept her or kind of feel sorry for her a little bit. She certainly never sticks up for her. The only instance when we sort of see her taking Wang Yaming's side is one night Wang Yaming is trying to get back into the school from having been outside. It's freezing cold. She's already rung the bell. The school custodian looks out, sees her, and basically says, no, I'm not letting you in. You're gross, and closes the gate. And finally, the narrator comes out, sees her there, and says, goodness gracious, why didn't you ring? She said, I did, but no one would let me in. The narrator really feels sorry for her there, but that's about as far as it goes.
Yeah, there's not really much sympathy for Wang Yaming anywhere in the story except for us as readers, and it's just grinding.
Now, as you mentioned, when you know the writer's background, it makes sense that this story would exist, right? It makes sense that someone who has experienced so much grinding sadness would write a story about grinding sadness, right? That does not mean that we as readers, especially we as readers in a very different context, also have to go, wow, this is an incredible piece of literature. For me, structurally, in terms of character and everything else, I don't find it a particularly compelling story. One of the works that calls to mind for me is Oliver Twist, because at a certain point in Oliver Twist, I remember thinking, okay, I get it. I promise I get it. This kid's life is rough. I get it. So now what? Like, are we just going to focus on the fact that his life is super rough? Like, that's the whole story? And to me, that was what this story was. Let's show you yet another shade of why her life sucks. And after a while, you're like, okay, but is there a struggle? Is there something to overcome? Is there something that's supposed to change? But nothing does change. It's just her life sucks. And now we're done.
I agree with you, Rob. This story is not super well written. It's not like a Lu Xun story, which we'll talk about more in the podcast series that's coming up, where Lu Xun is able to capture that grinding poverty and that grinding pain and that mistreatment, but he does it in a much more interesting and literary way. This is not that story. One reason I like this story is the symbolism of the hands and her dark hands versus, did you remember that passage where the principal or the headmistress's bony white hands are discussed?
Yeah.
It's kind of gross, but you also see the sort of difference in class and in terms of skin color. The symbolism is very easy to get. And I actually enjoyed having the story assigned in classes because it's really easy for undergrads to write about because the symbolism is so obvious. So that's one thing. I think that you and I are not enjoying, or we were left wanting a bit more, partially because it's just so clear cut. There's no ambiguity like in a Lu Xun story or even a Zhang Ailing story, which I those are, I think, the two great 20th century Chinese writers.
Well, we don't even have to go to the greats, the all-time greats. So just before this podcast, you and I were talking a little bit about Lao She, and I mentioned the novel Camels Youngza, which is also super bleak. Not much happens in that novel that's very happy either. But for me, the central character there is sad in a really peculiar and strange way. One of the reasons I read it all the way through is I was thinking, how do I wrap my head around this guy's motivations? This is so strange a narrative that I kept going all the way through to see, where is this going to go exactly? This one, on the other hand, about page 1, I went, oh, I see. So this is a story about a kid being mistreated at school. And that it kept being that for every paragraph. And like I say, a little variety, I was going to say, would not go amiss. I understand that may not have been her point, but I feel like in
the story, there was no growth.
Yeah, there's no growth in the story. And there is in so many other stories from that era, from so many other writers.
The stories of grinding poverty from the 1950s and 1960s and socialist era China are kind of crap. And I think that Xiao Hong's story is a cut above those. Even if we see there's no growth, we're not feeling like we're being pushed into sympathizing with Wang Yaming. Like I felt for Wang Yaming. I think that Xiao Hong's characterization of Wang Yaming is really, really good. That girl just never has a bad attitude about anything. And I knew that it was not going anywhere. I knew that it wasn't going to be a happy ending, but I really, really wanted it to be a happy ending. So I think that Xiao Hong has done a good job of making a character that is interesting, sympathetic, I guess. And that's something that I think Oliver Twist and the socialist crap from the 1950s never does. They never make three-dimensional characters, whereas I felt like, in the very least, even though I didn't like this story that much, all of the characters were three-dimensional.
Well, I'll definitely give you that this is better than the socialist era stuff, and it is definitely better than Oliver Twist, too. I've never understood why Oliver Twist is on a list of like all-time great novels. I could not stand that.
Sore?
Wow, it's a terrible story. Anyway. And yes, the main character, we do sympathize a lot with her. But that's part of what's hard for me about the story, of course, is I do sympathize with her. I used to teach farm kids at the university the first time I taught in China. There's a deep sense of, I wish things were better for this character. I wish. What got to me with this story, though, was that even with her attitude, nothing ever breaks. It's the same thing again and again. So I did sympathize with her, but I feel like she could have been given a stronger narrative than she was. It seems like she created this sympathetic character solely for the purpose of just pummeling her and making it hurt that much worse because we sympathize with the character. That is some narrative skill, which is why I said it's definitely better than a lot of other stuff from the 50s and 60s. But I can't help it. I just don't think it's that great a story for that reason.
That said, I mean, so Xiao Hong is writing this in the 1930s, and she has gone through a lot of these struggles herself. There's just something nice about being able to witness this torment that class brings around. I think that's what I would take away from this story is, this is a portrait of someone who really gets the short end of the stick in 1930s China. It's not the best read, but it's something that I think that you can learn a lot about from. And for those listeners who are actually looking to assign text to students, if you're teaching Chinese literature out there, it's hard to go wrong with this story because it's just so unambiguous that students get it. And it's a great way to kind of get them writing good papers.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. This is definitely not the kind of story we're going to have to discuss. What does it mean? Because it definitely means what it means, right? My final thing about this is that when I first read this, the first couple of pages, I remember I didn't even see when it was written. I hadn't read any bio, nothing. I just came at the story with no prior notions whatsoever. My first thought was, I wonder if she wrote this in 49 or after. Because it felt like this attempt to position her as kind of a critic of the old China, like upholding the downtrodden worker. Of course, it's not that at all. She wrote it in the mid-30s. I think it was 1936. So not that at all. But I still wonder, and maybe you can tell me because you taught this, how is this received in Maoist China? Because this would seem to me to be like, oh yeah, look, even in the 30s, they were writing about how good, hard-working, positive, forward-looking peasants were being kicked in the teeth by stuck-up, rich, foreign literature-reading countrymen and women.
It's my understanding that this did pretty well in Maoist China. I mean, she died before the CCP took power, but I think that this story was quite popular in 1950s, 1960s, and even today in China, I think it is still fairly popular.
You'd have to imagine so, right?
Before we go, Rob, if folks want more Chinese literature podcast, where do they go to?
And frankly, who doesn't want more Chinese literature podcast? ChinLitPod at Twitter, Chinese LitPod at Instagram, and Chinese Literature Podcast at Gmail. And of course, as always, Patreon. Chinese Literature Podcast. Look us up on any of those platforms. Send us a message if you've read this story and you actually found it uplifting, or you see in this story something that neither of us is catching and you really think, hey, these guys need to see this. Let us know, please.
Yeah.
Or tweet us.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.